want to bring out, I think I'm very usefully surrounded by lawyers, 3 of them in fact today, or law professors. So I'm going to give you, first of all, a little bit of a geographical twist to things. But I also want to talk about something alluded to by both speakers, and that is the kind of mediatization of the event. So let me start with that. I happened to be on the West Coast over the summer, and this was the most anticipated boat arrival ever, as far as I can tell. We'll start with the very alarmist Vancouver province, which all of you will know well. The only thing that worries me a little bit is I think we might have used the same boat there, and we did, maybe not the same in our poster, but a picture of a Thai boat, just anyone in particular, it says there, you can read it, the Marin Panich, but from Bangkok. Jails await refugees. So that's rather alarmist. The Vancouver sun was a little more tempered, not too much though. Tough love for 490 Sri Lankans. This is after the boat actually arrived. This came out on Saturday the 14th. The Globe, perhaps the voice of reason in this, although others like the province may disagree. A beacon of hope for migrants, a wake-up call for Canada. And again, this is in anticipation of the boat arrivals. And then the Victoria Times columnist, always a little bit concerned as the port of entry for many of these people. Canada braces for migrant ship arrival. I wanted to mention, I thought that your point about queue jumping, Dubith, was really interesting, and I wanted to say there's no queue, so there's no jumping. There is no lineup, as far as we know, on the West Coast. And equally, I'd like to take this little moment to say there's no such thing as a bogus refugee. There may be a bogus refugee claimant, but if indeed you're a refugee, you can't be bogus, because you've already been accepted. So when you do hear those media sort of very handy, crude shorthands that are used particularly by the newspapers, some of whom have just been mentioned, I won't name names, but I think that we need to be very aware of this and concerned. Certainly the boat arrivals in 1999, when we had almost 600 migrants from Fujian, China come, the bogus refugee shorthand became really the prevailing and salient discourse. So that's rather interesting. This is a final picture, which you can get I found you can find much better resolution on Google Images, but this one actually comes from, you can see I hoard newspapers. This actually comes from the Edmonton Journal, which I managed to get as I drove east back towards Toronto. And this should just conjure, hopefully for you, how dangerous a journey this was for people to undertake. If you look at that ship, and if you happen to read Mark McKinnon's coverage in the Globe and Mail about the history of that ship, and that it was sold with a view to sending it back, sending it out to go to boat heaven, or basically where boats go after they become useful and safe. So the idea that it made this trans-Pacific voyage is alarming in itself. So there we go with the mediatization, really more just a review than a deep analysis. But I do think we have to look at the geography of Sri Lanka to understand the importance of why people need to come to a country and make a refugee claim. It's easy if you're fleeing Bosnia to get to, say, Germany, because it's an overland journey and you go through maybe Croatia and Slovenia, but you can get to an EU country, now you can get to Slovenia, without too much trouble. You may need the help of a smuggler, you may not. But in any case, Sri Lanka is an island. I know this is a very self-evident point. India, its closest neighbor, as you can see on the map, is not a signatory to the 1951 Convention relating to refugees, nor is it a signatory to the 1967 protocols. So many Sri Lankan refugees, of course, or Sri Lankan asylum seekers, do find sanctuary and refuge in India. But that's a concern of the Indian government. UNHCR is not processing referrals there. Now, I'm going to return to the issue of resettlement in just a minute, but if you know that our resettlement program in Canada, which through the bill passed in June, we know will be expanded by a few 2,500 people by next year, we know that, that resettlement, for the most part, the vast majority of resettlement candidates, people who arrive directly processed overseas and then brought here, are UNHCR referrals. So getting away from Sri Lanka safely, there's the boat to India route, and there are other routes, one of which was the MV Sun Sea. So I just ask you to think through that geography, which I think is vital to what we're talking about here today. I also want to talk about those country conditions because of the work that I've done, and I'll end with a couple of anecdotes from my most recent visit, which was actually last June. So things have obviously changed since that time. But I think the country conditions are vital to the discussion and very much missed in all of the media coverage that I showed you earlier, but even the more sort of feature articles. I haven't heard too many people, except Gordon Weiss, who spoke or who wrote in the Globe a couple of weeks ago. He was the OCHA representative in Sri Lanka during the last 3 months of the fighting, and he wrote a really compelling article. I'll touch on his article and comments in a minute. But the Canadian High Commission in Colombo in 2009 was attacked by protesters. This is a picture of the little waiting room that you go into and you show your passport, for those of you who've been there. Demonstrators attacked the mission with stones and sprayed graffiti on the wall and painted over the security camera and so on. DFATE is quoted here as saying, Canada has expressed concern about the inadequate response by the Sri Lankan police to protect High Commission staff and the premises. Basically, Canada was lambasted in Colombo for being tiger lovers. And the Norwegians were up there with us. I think they were also, well, we know they were certainly happily waved goodbye to when the Sri Lanka monitoring mission left at the beginning of 2008, when the ceasefire, which had been in place from 2002 to 2008, very much ceased to exist. It had ceased to exist in practice many years before, but I also want to point to a report that both the speakers referred to, the International Crisis Group, now led by Louise Arbour, a Canadian, who's the president and CEO of ICG. And of course, it's been referred to already. Their report this year in May 2010 said that, quote, there is yet to be serious engagement or credible rebuttal of any of these substantive allegations that are contained in the report. It's worth going to their website and actually listening to Louise Arbour's video. It's quite compelling. And one of the major objections of the Sri Lankan government to this report is that it's a neo-colonial, as Greg pointed out. Craig was talking about this notion of the government will call everybody a name, but this one is a neo-colonial intervention by uninvited, North Americans and Europeans. 7,000 people, as many of you will know, were killed in the final months of the war, and again, that count is probably an undercount. Most were civilians, and the ICG just documents this and has collected evidence of it. The intentional shelling of civilians, hospitals, and humanitarian operations were their three main kind of points. And of course, we've heard again about the UN panel that this report and other evidence spawned by the Secretary General in Ban Ki-moon. And in July, of course, that panel, I don't know if any of you heard about the housing minister in Sri Lanka mounted a protest against the UN and went on a 52-hour hunger strike. But he led a protest against the UN panel, and again, 8 hours of protests, and the UN Secretary General was not pleased again, because diplomatic missions such as the Canadian High Commission, such as the UN panel of experts or any UN office, are supposed to be protected. That's by the Sri Lankan security forces or police forces, and so on. So that didn't happen. Gordon Weiss, who I mentioned earlier, writes this year about his experience last year. Sri Lanka is one of the most highly militarized societies in Asia, quite a claim to fame if one considers China, Burma, and Pakistan. It also features on a list of societies that kill their journalists and humanitarian workers. It manages public dissent and supplements law enforcement with death squads. And again, I'm echoing some things that have been said by earlier speakers. I think a reiteration of the number of people who remain on the disappeared list is important. He cites the number 5,749, and certainly one of the things that was very unsettling visiting last year and talking to friends in Batticaloa was the continued disappearances of people, despite the military conflict being over. I'm going to move along quickly here. When I was on this, I just want to mention one thing. China is sort of shining over Sri Lanka, and we've seen it move in to assist Sri Lanka in all kinds of ways, to the extent that in 2009, and this is actually, I wrote a paper just on aid to Sri Lanka during war, but I wasn't able to include this because I wrote it in like 2007 and 8. In 2009, 1.2 billion out of $2.2 billion in aid for Sri Lanka came from China, which is unprecedented and unheard of. It's very interesting. If we were to take Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism thesis from her book, The Shock Doctrine, which says, you know, during moments of disaster, people, companies and governments and other opportunists will come in and take advantage of situations. Many have noted the armor and tanks sold by China to Sri Lanka as being kind of important during those final months of the military victory that the Sri Lankan government took or claimed in May 2009. I also think we have to remember that Sri Lanka has failed this year to remain eligible for EU preferential market treatment, known as the GSP+, because of its human rights record and its unwillingness to kind of take remedial measures, because of course, anyway, the neo-colonial argument comes back in. So I think those are important pieces as well to think about, and the President's little deal with China also includes a seaport for Hyndman, which happens to be his constituency, and quite a rural constituency compared to the obvious choice for this, which would be Trincomalee, which, anyway, we won't get into where to put a port because I am not an engineer. But ultimately, many have said that Hyndman would not be their first choice. So what can we do? I think one thing that we need to do is have a little bit of faith in our system for refugee claimants. If indeed people from Fujian, China are not normally fleeing persecution, our system will hopefully tell us that. Unfortunately, with the 99 arrivals, the chance for a kind of fair and a hearing that wasn't influenced by public opinion was kind of impossible. But nonetheless, less than 5% of eligible claims were actually accepted among those whose claims were eligible. So if there's a credible threat, we accept people. If not, we send them back. Maybe I have too much faith in the system, but that's my position. We know that the Ocean Lady, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but everyone on board has at least been deemed eligible for a claim. So that is continuing on, and let's let that process play out. Again, we have to think carefully about why we treat people who arrive by boat differently than people who arrive by air. The vast majority of people who come here as refugee claimants do come by air, and with the Safe Third Country Agreement, it's much harder, of course, to come across the border unless you might have access to some type of smuggler who can get you across. And finally, getting back to the little twist, the assigned topic of resettlement to Canada. What can we do? Well, the source country, there are 3 ways that you can come to Canada. Three classes for resettlement. 1 is UNHCR referrals, which I mentioned. 2 is country of asylum claims, and those are for people who don't meet the the 1951 Convention definition, the 5 grounds for persecution in particular, but are nonetheless fleeing conflict, fleeing acute human rights violations, and therefore qualify for or are in demonstrated need of protection. The 3rd category are source country applicants, people who would meet the convention criteria if they were outside of their country, but they remain in their country. And with the new 2,500 spots that we have, I'm sure that the Canadian government will not allocate a certain number to any one group, but I would argue that we have a little bit of scope to increase the applicants of source country. And as it turns out, right off the CIC website, and maybe we should get word out, but this is what they say. As a refugee in the source country class, you can, A, apply without a referral, B, be referred by a referral organization, or C, be referred by a private sponsorship group. So there is an address and a visa office in Colombo, and ultimately I'm not sure what reception will be for people who could find their way there without fear of I don't know, being viewed or taped at the door and somehow having ill things go for them. But ultimately, this is one thing that we can think through from a resettlement point of view that would increase our scope of bringing people here rather than having them imperil their lives on the MV Sunseat or a similar boat. And just to finish, this is my last slide, but just to finish, I just wanted to mention one very unsettling anecdote for me, and maybe, I hope I can convey it well enough, but I remember, for those of you who've been to Colombo, usually once on a trip I'll go to Odell's, which is this, anyway, it's a shopping mall, which is awfully glitzy, and anyway, it's sort of interesting. But they do have some fun little souvenirs to bring home, so I sometimes go there and get a few souvenirs. And the one thing that truly appalled me and made me feel very strongly that we have to think carefully politically about what's going on is a display of T-shirts. This is June 2009, which said, buy our T-shirts, and Odell does all sorts of cute monkey T-shirts and so on. Some of them, anyway, not as tasteful as others. Buy this T-shirt, and proceeds will go to charity to assist people in the camps in northern Sri Lanka. And I just thought to myself, oh my goodness, people are making money by selling you T-shirts and giving the proceeds to camps which have been called internment camps, which really suspended the rights of Sri Lankan citizens and could only have existed in a state of emergency, which was declared in order for this to be possible. A kind of singular triumphalism has really taken over the city of Colombo, and I think more than just the city. And I did travel around, so throughout the country. So I just want to leave you with that, and with a sense that any real notion of political reconciliation, certainly not up there with things like changing the Constitution last week so that the current president sitting could sit for yet another term. So with the huge support that he has as president, he was able to get 2/3 majority to support his continued family ruling of the country. And I think we need to be very much on guard and aware of these things, because there's no sign yet that things are getting better for Sri Lankan Tamils in the country. Thank you.